Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Connor Goodwin. I'm the communications manager here at ProPublica, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. For those who don't know us, ProPublica is a nonprofit investigative newsroom dedicated to exposing abuses of power and betrayals of public trust by government, business, and other institutions, using the moral force of investigative journalism to spur real-world impact. Last Thursday, we published an investigation that revealed that Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas has accepted luxury trips from billionaire Republican donor Harlan Crow virtually every year for over 20 years without disclosing them. A number of experts we interviewed said that Thomas broke long-standing norms for judges' conduct, and several of those experts said his failure to report private jet flights appeared to violate federal disclosure laws. Thomas, for his part, issued a statement saying he'd consulted with unnamed members of the court who told him that he was not required to disclose such travel because it amounted to, quote, personal hospitality. The explosive story shook the nation, sparked national outrage, and created immediate impact. On Friday, Democratic lawmakers called for investigations and vowed to create stricter ethics rules for justices. And on Monday, yesterday, the Senate Judiciary Committee announced plans to hold a hearing in the coming days, quote, regarding the need to restore confidence in the Supreme Court's ethical standards, citing ProPublica's reporting. Joining us today is Josh Kaplan, one of the reporters behind the investigation, and ProPublica editor-in-chief, Steve Engelberg. Before I hand it off to Steve, I just want to note that we received more than 700 audience questions ahead of time. We won't be able to hit them all, but we've identified common themes and are going to try and cover as much ground as possible. If you'd like to submit a question in today's session, you can do so by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and typing it there. Thanks again for joining us. I'll let Steve take it from here. You guys can turn on your cameras now. Thanks.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Steve Engelberg. I am the editor-in-chief at ProPublica, a job I've held for the last 10 years. I'd like to introduce to the audience Josh Kaplan, who has been a reporter with us for the last 3 years. Joined us as a freelance journalist and a fellow at ProPublica from Washington, D.C., where he was writing a column about criminal justice for the Washington City paper. He holds a degree in mathematics from the University of Chicago, which I suppose may come in handy for some of the work that we're doing now. So Josh, tell us a little bit about how you and your partners on this story, Justin Elliott and Alex Miersky, got into this. What sort of got this started?
Yeah, so we, towards the end of last year, Justin and I, we're starting to think about ways we could cover the judiciary, and we were casting, frankly, probably too wide of a net. We were looking at all sorts of stories at once, and we were filing records requests and combing through documents, and there was one flight we found that caught our eye. We found some evidence that seemed to indicate that Justice Thomas had flown on this billionaire Harlan Crow's plane from DC to New Haven, Connecticut for what was roughly a 3-hour trip. It looked like maybe a lunchtime appointment. We weren't sure what it was, and then flew back on the jet 3 hours later. And this seemed, potentially newsworthy in its own right, but also that it was such a short trip for a private jet flight that it suggested to us like this might be part of a habit. This might be part of a larger pattern. And we started really digging in.
So tell us a little bit about, I know many people on this conference have read the article, but just tell us a little bit, what were the high points of, as things began to unfold, what were the sort of high points of what you found?
Yeah, so we found, the extent and frequency of what we found was really surprising to us. So we found that Justice Thomas has been accepting these luxury trips from Harlan Crow virtually every year for 20 years. And that includes flights on Crow's large private jet. That includes international cruises on a super yacht, regular vacations at his luxury resort in the Adirondacks. One of the more recent examples we found, just one example was in 2019, Justice Thomas flew to Indonesia on Crow's private jet and then spent 9 days island hopping with him on a super yacht staffed by a private chef and a host of stewardesses. We were told that if Thomas had chartered the plane and the yacht himself, the cost could have exceeded $500,000 for that trip.
How do you report a story like that? Who do you talk to? I mean, there clearly are not an enormous number of documents. So how do you think about finding information out about something like that?
Yeah, I mean, kind of the remarkable, something I hadn't fully appreciated until we were deep into this, is that to live this luxuriously, you have a lot of people involved in kind of mundane aspects of your life. If I was to take you on United Air and we rented rooms in a nice hotel in Paris, it'd be really hard to find. But Crow has staff on his yacht. Crow has, he has staff at his private resort. He has all sorts of staff involved in coordinating, different aspects of his life. And so we just started making calls, and we, had a spreadsheet of a few hundred names, and, talked to dozens of people from, the staff on his yacht to members of the Bohemian Grove to, an Indonesian scuba diving instructor who spent time on Crow's yacht while Thomas was there.
Fascinating. And I'm sure people talk to people, so word gets around. And then there were some social media things I gather that proved helpful.
Yes. We, once we would, had some inkling that Thomas might have gone to, X location around X time, we started scrubbing through all sorts of social media. I mean, or another instance was, we were staring at a photo we had of Harlan Crow in Indonesia, and we noticed that Harlan Crow was wearing a polo shirt that had the logo of his yacht and then said Indonesia, summer 2019 or something like that. And we're like, does he make shirts for all of the trips? And we asked some people we've been talking to, and they're like, yeah, he often does. And so we went down this rabbit hole of trying to find as many photos of Clarence Thomas as we could, and ultimately, found a photo of him wearing one of these shirts at what seemed like a tech conference maybe, but it said Greek Islands, March 2007, which was a trip we didn't know anything about until then.
Fascinating. I guess in the modern world, it's hard to move around without people noticing you or photographing you, particularly if you're famous. So you go at some point, you do your reporting, you look at the official disclosure forms that every justice files, and you start looking for these trips. Are they there?
None of them were. None of the trips we found were disclosed by Justice Thomas.
So that raised an interesting question. I know with ProPublica, we have a policy we're very proud of, that we notify people well before a story comes out what we're going to say. We call it a no surprises letter. We don't want anyone to ever be surprised by what they read about themselves, or frankly, anything that's important to them or their friends. So we do that as a matter of course. So you and your colleagues sent a no surprises letter to Thomas, asking him to explain this. What did he say back?
Well, so before we published, we sent him detailed questions and followed up repeatedly, and he didn't respond to us. After we published, he released a statement, which is actually fairly rare for Justice Thomas, in which he said that Crow was a dear friend of his, and he said that early in his career he'd asked some of his colleagues about the disclosure rules, and they'd suggested to him that because Crow was a friend and he didn't have business directly before the court, that this was okay and that he didn't need to disclose it.
So sort of like a kind of hospitality exemption, right? If you have a college friend and you go stay in their house for the weekend, you don't have to disclose the value of that stay.
Right, and there's a personal hospitality exemption in the law, in the disclosure law, which is a ethics law that was passed after Watergate, requires Supreme Court justices and many other government officials to disclose most gifts. It appears Thomas might have been referencing that, but after he released this statement, we went to 7 different ethics law experts, including former ethics lawyers for Congress and for the White House. And all of them told us that the law clearly required that he disclose things like these private jet flights, and that if he is arguing that they were exempt from disclosure because they were personal hospitality, that he's incorrect on what the law requires.
Well, let me ask you a question. Neither one of us, neither you nor I, Josh, are constitutional lawyers, nor would we play them on TV. But I mean, this is a law passed by the legislative branch and signed by the president. I mean, so how does one branch tell another branch what to do? Does this law really apply to the Supreme Court, as far as we know?
As far as we know, yes, in the sense, but it's an important and interesting question. So the law explicitly says that it applies to Supreme Court justices, and since it's been passed, Supreme Court justices have been filing the annual financial disclosures that are required by the law. However, there's potentially a larger constitutional issue at play here. So in 2011, Chief Justice John Roberts, in an annual report, talked about how there was some chatter at the time of there being more laws passed by Congress. And Chief Justice Roberts said that the question has never been addressed as to whether Congress has the ability to impose rules on the Supreme Court. And he acknowledged that there were some rules and said that the justices had been complying with them, but he raised the question of whether this was actually something that they would be required to do if the law was challenged, and also if Congress had the power to impose more rules, which I think is very germane to our current moment.
Right, very much in the air now. Well, let's go back a little bit. So Clarence Thomas comes on the court in 1991. Many of us will recall fairly controversial hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee, then chaired by Senator Joe Biden. He is confirmed. When did he and Harlan Crow cross paths, and who is Harlan Crow?
Yeah, so they met a few years after Justice Thomas went on the court, and Harlan Crow is a real estate tycoon based in Dallas. He is an heir to his father's real estate fortune, and he has been an enormously successful businessman overseeing kind of his family's business, real estate and investment empire. And he's also a major and influential figure in conservative politics. He's long been a major Republican donor. He's given over $10 million in disclosed political contributions. And he's also given to dark money groups. Exactly how much and exactly to who, is not fully known. But what we do know is that he has given millions of dollars to ideological efforts to shape the law and the judiciary and move them further to the right. So, one group that he's donated to that I think many people on this call will know is the Federalist Society. He also, sits on the boards of major pro-business think tanks that, have scholars that advance specific conservative legal theories and who occasionally file amicus briefs with the Supreme Court.
So you mentioned the 2011 and John Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, writing, this paper that was sort of circulated at the time in regard to questions. I mean, in fact, weren't some of those questions also at that point in 2011 being raised by what had been revealed about Thomas in that year?
Yes. So, I mean, Roberts does not specifically, he does not mention Thomas in this writing, but a lot of court observers think that's what he was responding to. So in 2011, the New York Times and Politico had a series of articles that were kind of the first real revelations of the close ties between Justice Thomas and Harlan Crow. Politico had reported that Crow had given I believe it was $500,000 donation to a Tea Party group that Thomas's wife had founded, and which also paid her $120,000 salary. And then the Times went through disclosures that he had disclosed but had never really been put in one place or examined or made sense of, and also revealed that he had that Crow had given $500,000, I think, yeah, $500,000 to fund what was essentially a pet project of Thomas's, to create a museum in the town he grew up in.
That's fascinating. So in one way, this was really on the sort of public record a while ago, and the disclosure statements contained some information that became controversial. Did his disclosure statements continue to be detailed in any way at all? Was there anything on them after 2011, and what happened?
Yeah, I mean, so Thomas used to be a lot more, used to disclose a lot more back in the 90s, actually. In the 90s, he once disclosed a private jet flight from Crow to the Bohemian Grove in California. And when these disclosures would get released to the public, newspapers would write about it. And by around 2000, 2004-ish, he, for the most part, stopped disclosing things. He, I think recently, just like in the last 5-7 years, disclosed a gift, like a physical gift from Crow. It was, I believe, a bust of Frederick Douglass. But in terms of these vacations, the travel, that has completely been absent from his required reports to the public.
We're going to segue you into some audience questions. One of the audience questions is about the experts we consulted, and a member of the audience asked, were they just Democrats? Were they Republicans and Democrats? What were the political leanings of the folks that you and the team spoke with?
Yeah, we spoke with experts who'd served in both, Republican and Democratic administrations. Some of them were, career ethics officials who'd served in both. One, for instance, was George W. Bush's, the White House's chief ethics lawyer during the Bush administration. So we tried to ask as wide a variety of people as we could, who also had the kind of experience to have be in a place to have thought carefully about the law and understand it rigorously.
One thing I want to just go back to for a moment on sort of the ethical, constructs around this. We've talked a lot about the post-Watergate federal law that requires all federal officials at a certain level to disclose aspects of their personal business and so on. What about judges? Are judges covered by anything, and how does that work?
Yeah, so judges are covered by the same disclosure laws. They also have another document. It's called the Judiciary's Code of Conduct, and this covers every federal judge below the Supreme Court. And there are some kind of specific practical rules or principles that are laid out around questions like recusal. When must a judge recuse themselves from a case? And there's also, this is where a lot of the lofty, broader ethical norms and standards for the judiciary are articulated. So there's a lot of language in there requiring judges to, for instance, avoid even the appearance of impropriety, and to conduct themselves at all times in a way that promotes public confidence in their integrity and their independence. And this is an enforceable document that there's an administrative apparatus within the judiciary that can take disciplinary action if a judge is found to have violated the code. It explicitly does not apply to the Supreme Court. However, the Supreme Court, Roberts has said that the justices do consult this document for guidance. He isn't saying that this is irrelevant to their behavior.
Yeah, now we get a very interesting question from an audience member who was listening to a podcast put up by our colleagues at Slate, who notes that correctly that the travel policy for high-level judges, although not the Supreme Court, was changed shortly before the release of the ProPublica article, and the Chief Justice John Roberts sits on the board that sets the policy. And the question is, why was that not, and has that not been a big story? And I will remind listeners just before we get into that remember that this document, even if Roberts is involved, these policies do not apply to the Supreme Court. So this is the Judicial Conference changing rules for all the judges except the Supreme Court. But talk a little bit about why wasn't that a big deal at the time?
We're talking about the changes in the financial disclosure rules.
Yeah, and maybe you could go a little bit into what changed, because it did seem, I think coincidentally, as if the people making the new rules might have anticipated this, because the rules specifically address travel questions. So what did they change, and why wasn't that much of a story at the time?
Yeah, I mean, there was some coverage of it. I mean, and I should say these financial disclosure guidelines do apply to justices because they are required to file financial disclosures. It's a bit of a separate thing from the ethical, the broader ethical codes that apply to lower court judges. And what this update did is, made explicit things that had basically laid out more specific scenarios as to when disclosure is required and when disclosure isn't. And there was some genuine ambiguity in the judiciary until this update happened around questions like, corporate ownership. If I go to a resort that, if I'm a justice and I go to a resort that you own, how do I determine if this is something that I have to disclose or something that, because you're the one that's offering it to me and you own the resort, I can go there for free and not let the public know about it. And so clarify questions like that. But also I think there's been some things lost in translation around this update. All the ethics law experts we talked to did say that transportation has clearly always been required for judges, for judges and justices to disclose it. And that includes private jet flights or cruises on a yacht. And the law hasn't changed. And this update did say that, it makes this explicit, but everyone we've talked to, all the lawyers we've talked to have said there is really never an interpretation of this that would lead you to conclude otherwise, even before the recent update.
So to state it in sort of plain language, someday I retire and I decide that I'm going to go out and play the lottery. I win the lottery. I decide to buy a mansion in Hawaii. And I invite one of the justices out. If I send them the plane ticket, that's a problem, isn't it?
Yes.
Can't do that.
Yes.
Theoretically, if I own my estate that I bought with my lottery winnings, if they fly out there on their own, potentially it's not a disclosable event.
Although I should say it's not a problem, actually. That's a kind of a funny segue in that if you send them their plane ticket and they don't disclose it, that's a problem. However, there really are very, very few restrictions on what justices can accept. So if Thomas had done everything that if Thomas's vacations were exactly the same, he went on these extremely extravagant, very regular trips around the world, flying on a private jet, going on a super yacht, staying at a luxury resort, and he disclosed all of it, this would be completely within the guidelines of the rules and laws governing Supreme Court justices. And that's a really stark contrast to the other branches of government. If you look at members of Congress, for instance, they're generally prohibited from accepting a gift from anyone that's worth more than $50. And there's some exceptions, but to take a trip like this, even from a close personal friend, they need to get a formal pre-approval from an ethics committee.
Well, and in fact, this came up in your reporting, didn't it? We have published in the story, for those who have seen it, a photorealist painting of Clarence Thomas at Harlan Crow's Adirondack's resort, and it's a really quite realistic painting of 5 people sitting around. One of those people is a former Thomas law clerk named Mark Poloni, I believe that is, right?
Pauletta.
I'm sorry, Mark Poletta. And Mr. Paletta, you interviewed him about all this. What did he do when he was offered? He was at the time working in the White House, right? What did he do when he was offered the chance to visit this for free?
Yeah, so we had an email exchange with Mr. Paletta, actually about he was also on the Indonesia trip. He was there with Justice Thomas, and we got his financial disclosure because he was at the time a lawyer in the Trump administration, and he hadn't disclosed it. So we went to him and asked him why, and he told us that when Crow invited him on this trip, he went to his agency's ethics council, and they told him that he would need to reimburse Mr. Crow for this, and so he did.
So that's pretty clear. It's an executive branch official. He can't accept a gift from somebody who might have business before the federal government. He has to pay for it himself. Is there any real purpose? I mean, I think one of the things we try to think hard about at ProPublica is, why do people do the things they do? It helps us, I think, write sympathetically and effectively about them. Is there a good reason why the Supreme Court would have a different set of rules that you've come across in your reporting? Why is it this way?
It's an excellent question. I mean, I think part of it might have to do with the level of scrutiny the court has had over the years, because frankly, these harsher restrictions that the other branches of government have didn't come out of nowhere. They didn't just decide, like, okay, the law requires us to do this, but we're going to go above and beyond, and members of Congress aren't going to take gifts that are worth more than $50. The strict laws in Congress, for instance, followed the Jack Abramoff scandal, which, as people may remember, involved a lobbyist that was giving all sorts of perks to members of Congress. And after that happened, they really imposed stricter rules. And so I think it may simply be that I can't speculate to why the court hasn't taken this upon themselves, but haven't had the level of scrutiny or the level of scandal of some of the other branches, and so maybe had less reason to feel they needed to tighten down.
Well, certainly up until recent years, the Supreme Court, I think, has consistently been, of the three branches, in polling, the most respected, the most popular. Congress for many years now being very low in the ratings, and the White House pretty low, and the court, until I think the last 2 or 3 years, always by far the most respected. Several folks asked questions of us, Josh, which I guess we should both respond to. Are we aware of the Wall Street Journal editorial, and what do we say to this argument that it's all a big smear? I'll certainly let you answer that. I might have a thought or two myself.
We thought these were really important facts to get before the public, and that they would help inform the public conversation about the Supreme Court and what we should expect of justice's conduct. And I think it has sparked that conversation. I mean, to the notion that it's a politically motivated. I mean, I would like to emphasize that, for me and Justin and Alex, that was, we didn't go out looking for what we could find on Justice Thomas. We went out looking for, started researching Supreme Court justices, and we found that a lot of these gifts for Thomas, and so we went in that direction. And we're still very much interested in the topic, and we're going to keep reporting. I should say that if anyone on this call happens to have any information we should know about any justice, we would be extremely, extremely eager to hear from you.
Yeah, perhaps our colleague Connor can put in the chat a way to reach us with that kind of information. And I would just add, as editor, when I heard and was interested in the subject of covering the judiciary more closely, one of the initial thoughts I had turned to not only the 2011 New York Times story on Thomas, but also more recent work by the Wall Street Journal, very fine work on the federal district judges who theoretically have a tighter regimen and were nonetheless deciding a lot of cases in which they had some personal financial interests. And so that certainly made me want to know more about the judiciary. And when the team came to us and had this focus on the Supreme Court, it seemed to me to make good sense Number one, it's the highest court in the land, and number two, from a journalistic perspective, it seemed to have been a little bit less examined of late. And so that's what motivated us. This was not, people, I've seen the tweets and so on about, I've seen actually some interesting tweets on both sides. On the right, there are people who said, well, this is clearly aimed at Thomas, who's a leader of originalism, and ProPublica is trying to take that down, which clearly has nothing to do with anything in our coverage. And then some other people, frankly, saying on the left, well, would ProPublica cover this if the names were George Soros and Elena Kagan? And let me assure you, we will. So again,
I would love to write that story.
Yes, if anyone on this call knows anything about anybody, on any side of the Supreme Court that has been in arrangements like this is, we think, worthy of putting before the public in a very factual way. And that's what we tried to. The tone of the story was to try to be as factual as possible. I had an interesting question here, Josh. And you have already in your relatively young career done a lot of really fascinating things. Josh worked on a quite amazing story on our departure from Afghanistan, interviewing soldiers who survived the blast in one of the last days of the war in Kabul. So you've already had your share of big stories, but one of the people on this call asked, Josh, what was it like for you as a journalist, a person working on this story? When did it get excited? When did you know you were exciting? When did you know you were onto a big scoop that would make a stir? Oh, this is good. Did your editors make you double check certain facts?
Oh, they didn't have to. We quadruple checked all the facts in our story. But yes, it was a really satisfying reporting process, because we kind of had this continual stream of new stuff coming in, and things we had to ultimately leave on the cutting room floor. It was, early on, we were looking a lot at Camp Topridge and learning how often, Thomas had been going there and what it was like and what happened while he was there. And then suddenly, we start hearing about the yacht and start digging in on that side. So I don't think there was like any one moment. We always found it was, even when in retrospect, things that seem, were 2,000 words down in our story felt remarkable when we found them. And then it kept kind of ballooning.
Isn't that really typical of the process of any good investigative story, right? One of the things that happens is you don't really know where you're going. I think when you guys started this, we had no notion of what we would find. And that's kind of why this is one of the greatest careers you could ever have.
Yeah, no, there's nothing more fun than talking to people who know a lot more than you do, and trying to get washed away wherever the facts end up going.
A lot of people have asked about, and we did have a line in the story about this, that this was seemingly without precedent. And we're always, I will share with our audience, we're always very nervous in that kind of writing in the world of journalism, because, I'm a former New York Times employee, basically a reporter and editor. The word unique is essentially banned at the New York Times, because the minute you say something is unique, somebody calls you up and says, no, it's not. But we did feel that we could say, as far as we could tell, this was without precedent. Has any other Supreme Court justice in history other than Thomas been caught up in anything that looks like this?
Yeah, there are a number of scandals, and we felt that what we decided to say is that the extent and frequency of these gifts going from Crow to Thomas was unprecedented in the court's modern history. But, I think probably the most noteworthy one in the last, 60 odd years is Abe Fortas, who was a Supreme Court justice who in the late 60s, I believe it may have been the early 70s, ultimately had to resign because he received a $20,000 retainer from an organization tied to a friend of his. And the retainer was set up such that it was going to give him an annual payment every year for the rest of his life. And he ultimately, this friend of his got caught up in an insider trading scandal. And Fortis ultimately returned the money, and when that case made its way up to the court, he recused himself from the case. But the outcry from lawmakers, Democrats and Republicans alike, was such that he ultimately felt he had to resign.
Right. Now, one interesting thing about that, and I can assure our listeners, this is not the case in ProPublica's work. We don't talk about our sources, but I do want to, we've been clear about this from the beginning. I mean, in that particular case, by then, Republican President Nixon was in office, and the Nixon administration was aware of this scandal involving the $20,000 payment, which had not been public knowledge. And they worked closely with a magazine, Look magazine, to help make sure that this became publicly known. And so you certainly could make an argument, now that we have all the Nixon tapes and some of the records from that period, that the Nixon administration was trying to force out a democratically appointed, LBJ's had appointed Fortis, and Fortis was a close friend of LBJ's. They were trying to force him out and potentially change the composition of the court. You know, again, it's not typical that we would comment on sources and methods of how we do things, but I just want to assure people on this call, this is nothing like that. This is not the origins of this story at all, and I think it's important that people know that this is the result of, as you're hearing, the what we would call the investigative method, having somewhat unlimited time, not entirely unlimited, but somewhat unlimited time and space to really dig into things and try to learn things that that maybe nobody knew. Let's talk a little bit briefly in the time we have left, Josh. One of the questions that certainly came up for us, and I know it's come up for the public, how confident can we be that this relationship is as it's been described? Harlan Crow says the Thomases are dear friends, and vice versa. And that he has nothing before the court of any interest. I mean, how do we know that? Can we be certain of that?
I mean, I think there's a lot unknown about the relationship still. I mean, Crow, you know, we talked to people who know both men, and they told us they have become genuine friends. But, you know, they've spent a lot of time together over the years in private or relatively private places all over the world. And we know very, very little about what they've discussed, or whether, you know, Crow has had some influence on Thomas's views, whether, you know, directly or indirectly. You know, Crow told us that they've never discussed a pending case, and that he's never sought to influence Justice Thomas. But I mean, I think this, you know, a lot of the, you know, you talk to political scientists, they'll tell you about, you know, how the people you associate with and spend time with have, you know, inevitably have an influence on your views. And I think this broader question of how this relationship, or if this relationship that spans decades has impacted Thomas is very much still a live one.
What about, and we don't really know much about this, what about other people that he could have interacted with, unbeknownst even to Harlan Crow? I mean, as I understand it, that private plane had more than 2 or 3 seats on it, right? How many people were on a trip like that, and what kind of people were they?
Yeah, I mean, Crow not only has this access to Justice Thomas, but that access extends to kind of anyone else he chooses to invite along on these trips. And so, I mean, Topridge is kind of the easiest example to look at. It's this resort that is guests don't pay, it's invitation only. Crow owns it, and you know, we've found, you know, Thomas has been up there with Leonard Leo, the leader of the Federalist Society, who a lot of people kind of regard as a principal architect of the Supreme Court's turn to the right in recent years. You know, in one trip in 2017, we learned Thomas's other guests that week included, you know, executives at, you know, Verizon and PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is the accounting giant, major Republican donors, one of the leaders of the American Enterprise Institute, influential conservative think tank. So we certainly don't have a full picture of who all has joined these trips over the years, but and we have no you have no evidence that anything untoward happened with those with these other people. Crow told us that to his knowledge, no one's tried to lobby or influence Thomas, and they wouldn't invite anyone who he thought might. But I think it's a really interesting question of who is in this milieu, and what is the impact of that on Thomas been?
Right. I mean, in a sense, unless, which I don't expect would happen, that Thomas or the court were to disclose more details about who was on these trips and so on, it's going to be pretty hard to know whether somebody who was in proximity to the justice
Yes.
had a case. I mean, we should point out that there are many, thousands, tens of thousands of court cases filed all over the country, and I think the Supreme Court grants cert in what, about 200. So it's a small number, to be sure, but it's not nothing, and it's incredibly influential. All right, I think we have time for a couple more questions. I think one question that somebody wanted to ask was, Ginny Thomas, of course, has been much in the news with the revelations post January 6th about her role in contesting and protesting, sending even emails to the state legislators about the election outcomes. Does Ginny Thomas typically go with Clarence Thomas on these trips? Does he go by himself, or what do we know about that?
For most of the ones that we, I mean, I guess we don't have a full picture, but yes, she often is on these trips with Justice Thomas. She was in Indonesia. She's been at Topbridge with him. There's a kind of a long history of Thomas and his wife, and Harlan Crow and his wife, all traveling together to places around the world.
Which, is not surprising. I mean,
no, not surprising at all.
Clearly, the justice's calendar is such that they do work very hard for a period of the year, and then there's a period of the year where things are a little quieter. So I can understand that he and his wife would take these trips. So we're gonna thank everybody for all their questions. This has really been they've been flooding in here, and I've been trying to deal with them as quickly as we can and as broadly as we can. I did want to sort of close with a little question. Just you're new to this, but it is a question I think that everybody has wondered about. We saw the Democrats in the Senate, Dick Durbin in particular, putting out a statement saying that they expected that they would want to legislate about this, that there may be, coming from the Congress, a Supreme Court code of ethics that might have some enforcement mechanisms. I don't know, an ethics officer maybe. What do you think? Is that possible? Do you think that's going to happen, or is that really a kind of a dream here?
I don't know. I mean, there's been some talk. There've been bills floated about this for a while now, and this certainly is the most momentum and concerted action I've seen toward imposing new rules on the court in a long time. You have people like Dick Durbin, vowing to act and calling this reporting a call to action. So far, nothing there's been no real concrete steps in that direction. They've also demanded that Justice Roberts investigate, lawmakers have, whether or not whether or not he intends to do so is still unclear. So, I mean, there've been various kind of controversies around the court for a long time now, and there haven't been major ethical reforms since the late 70s. But I think it remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, I'll maybe close out here and just say that, somebody who's started off very early in his career covering the Supreme Court for the Dallas Morning News and being a sort of great fan of it, I am skeptical that they will accept this, but I think one of the things we all know about journalists is that they're really terrible predictors of the future. And so I'm not going to contradict you, Josh, because things can change, and we all of the stuff we cover is testament to that. So I'd like to thank you for your time, and while you're still working on this interesting and exciting story, and thank our audience for joining us.